Hi everyone, welcome to week 9 of Introduction to Communication. As you know, I'm supporting your lecturer by providing you with these lectures. It's expected though that you will take notes and review anything you don't understand with your lecturers during your tutorial time. I hope that you're surviving in these weird and strange times. I guess, as I said last week, and you may have heard or remembered, the good thing about these lectures is you can listen to them over and again if you don't understand something, and obviously take down notes and go and see your lecturer in regards to anything you want to query. So let's have a look at week 9. I'll just make myself small. Okay, so week 9. This week we're going to be talking about misunderstandings and in particular looking at cultural and social barriers. So what is a misunderstanding? What is mutual understanding to start with? Well, effective communication does not take place unless the message is received with mutual understanding. And so what that means is that the sender and receiver share the same interpretation of all verbal and all non-verbal messages within that communication. Now just think about that. How often, even with someone you know very well, is there, the chance that they may have misunderstood the message? Are you the kind of person who then thinks, I wonder, did they really understand what I was trying to say? Or do you think to yourself, I'm not sure what they were trying to say, when someone communicates with you. So we need to strive towards mutual understanding, but sometimes it's really difficult to achieve, and that's what we're going to talk about today. So mutual understanding involves communicating with care and the best intentions. However, it does not guarantee understanding, and there you've got a really good graphic of sometimes what it's like. And don't you find that often happens with people whom you know really well? Maybe you skip some content, or you assume that they know, or you assume that they're kind of with you in terms of what it is that you're thinking about, and it turns out that they're not. So here we've got a graphic, maybe which perfectly describes what mutual understanding should look like. You've got there on the left, you've got, and you now know what this is, you've got encoding. So the person who is the sender is encoding that message. What words are they choosing? What format are they choosing, etc. Then you've got context, which we are going to talk about today, although we haven't spoken about it in the past. That sort of sits above everything you do and say. You sit within a particular context, and then the receiver, who you hope receives that message which you've communicated via a channel. Of course, we know about channels, text messages, emails, and so forth. And then there's decoding done, and they try to understand what it is that you said. But of course, there's this part here, which I'm circling with my mouse. It's the receiver's context. What exactly is receiver's context? We'll get into context today quite a bit. And so a misunderstanding can occur. So say, for example, if that encoding was not received and decoded appropriately, a misunderstanding could occur. So what's a misunderstanding? It is a failure to understand something correctly. We know that, don't we? A misunderstanding of the government's plans. In other words, misinterpretation, misconstruction, or misreading. So what influences? Why is it so hard for humans to encode a message and send it and it be decoded appropriately? Why is it so hard? Whether it be in personal relationships or whether it be at work, in work relationships, why does it seem so hard? Why are there mixed messages? Let's have a look at this. So many factors affect the ability of communicating individuals to achieve mutual understanding, and we've defined what mutual understanding is. And here are some of them, but it's not an exhaustive list. Language. Obviously, we know about language barriers. But, are we also talking about language in context? So there's that word again. Language in context, where we use jargon. So people who work in your industry, whatever industry you work in, would know what certain words mean because you all work in the same industry. That's called jargon. So language, which obviously applies to different languages, which we know, and can create a barrier and certainly lead to misunderstanding, but not just language in that respect. We also think about language in terms of, as I just said, jargon and word usage. So again, that lends itself to jargon, right? But even across, if you think about it, across generations, I've got a 14-year-old son and he thinks everything's lit and he thinks he's woke. I don't know what he's talking about half the time, so he pretty much needs subtitles. Making assumptions about meaning. Again, that's contextual, isn't it? It sort of relates to us. What do I mean when I say the word love? Does it mean the same to the other person? I was watching recently, I hope you don't watch this, but I was watching Maths, Married at First Sight. And this guy on it, was with this woman and he keeps telling her he loves her to death, love, 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 using that word prolifically. And she keeps saying, yeah, but, we haven't got a relationship. It's not the sort of relationship that I interpret when a person says love, right? And so is he making an assumption about what the word love means? She's obviously, got a different interpretation. And here's that context idea that we're going to be talking about. The context is really important. What does it mean in this place and in this time? So we'll go into that a bit deeper later on. Differing expectations and desires. Again, I think that links to all of them, doesn't it? Presence of strong emotions. And this is really important, and I don't know if you've heard of emotional intelligence, but it's a really big, it's a really big concept in the workplace at the moment. Being able to understand when you're experiencing emotion, kind of why you're experiencing emotion, but not just that, being able then to register that you're experiencing that emotion and being able to still respond appropriately. And that means not getting angry, not blowing it out of proportion, not, being self-aware, being aware that the emotion that you're experiencing will, dictate what kind of words that you use with the person that you're speaking to. And so strong emotions can lead to some pretty intense interactions, which, if you were more self-aware, may not have occurred. Okay, so we get into that a little bit, but you will certainly get more into that in some of your other courses, emotional intelligence. And the time invested and or available. A quick message, sometimes abbreviated, comes across, as being terse or as being a little bit short. Oh, is there a problem? And yet it was really just about time and availability. So every individual has a culturally determined perspective, affecting his or her understanding, expectations and styles of communication. And so what we're saying is that imagine all of those influencing factors and now put them into your culture and then compare them with another culture. So you've got two different cultures with all of these factors that might influence misunderstanding or influence understanding, and then you've got that crossover. So misunderstandings are, they're not just going to happen. They're going to happen. It's a foregone conclusion, pretty much. Let's face it. So let's go a bit deeper into the cultural influences. So your culture influences your understanding of every part of your daily life. So it's something that you need to think about, because most of you are in a different culture. You're in Australian culture, and perhaps many of you haven't lived here for a long time. And a lot of your version of things, or the way that you interpret life, is not interpreted the same way here. You may have already come across that. And so what we're saying is that that is a real and definite and normal factor in terms of misunderstandings. And the way to get around it is to begin to acknowledge it and have awareness about it. Culture helps construct the foundation for people's values, beliefs and choices in life, and culture makes societies unique, making it an essential element in influencing our everyday lives. This is so obvious, but it's important to recognise. And the other thing is that you, being of a different culture, working in Australia, maybe with Australians who aren't so aware of the cultural differences that they may have in comparison to others, it gives you just that bit of insight, because your self-awareness will, you can bring that to the table. And so when communicating, you could even communicate, hey, listen, that's different in my culture, so let's talk about that. So I think that these cultural influences don't necessarily need to become the big issue that they could, because you're becoming self-aware. So people are different and people do things differently. Sometimes the simplest of tasks are done differently between cultures. Consideration of cultural differences is essential when communicating. Look, we're going to get into some of these differences, but they have whole courses devoted to Japanese business studies. So how do, for example, the Japanese do business, and how does that look in terms of how Australians do business, and what are the differences, what are the likely clashes. And so it's recognised, highly recognised, that in the workplace we need to be aware and we need to be cognizant, so we need to be sort of thinking about cultural differences and how this could be influencing outcomes. So here's an onion. What's that got to do with anything? Well, it is believed that at the core of cultural influences are the cultural beliefs and values. So what is it that our culture inculcates? And that means makes a part of us, okay? Because that's where your beliefs and values are coming from. They're coming from your environment, your culture. And that's kind of deep down. And outwardly, what we see here, right here, is the visible cultural differences. I see Indian people eat beautiful, Indian food. That's different to me. Live in a different home, maybe wear different clothes, a sari, etc., etc. And so the cultural influences are both visible, I see that, but they're also invisible to me. They're deep down inside of that other culture, the beliefs and values and norms and behaviours. And your norms and behaviours are what is culturally acceptable. What is it that this particular culture does? And obviously they're different across the world. And they are the areas that can influence. So what are some causes of misunderstandings other than culture? Well, what about attitudes? So we've got some pictures here. Attitudes linked to negative stereotypes and biases can also create misunderstanding. A stereotype, what is that? It is any thought widely adopted about a specific type of individual or certain ways of behaving intended to represent the entire group of those individuals or behaviours as a whole. Now we know that we use stereotypes as shortcut ways of understanding things. It's a psychological tool, basically, but it's also cultural. We do stereotypes in order to quickly be able to understand mentally what this might be. And they can be very, very useful, but also extremely damaging. Extremely damaging because, let's face it, the truth is we are not homogenous. We are not just one big sort of lump. This is an Australian, or this is a Sri Lankan, or this is a person from Pakistan, right? Everybody is different and individual. But not just around culture do we make these stereotypes. We also make them, if you have a look here in the first image, we make them around sex, around gender. A boy rides a truck. A girl plays with dolls. Now that's a stereotype. And it can help, but sometimes it can be really a hindrance, because the person who's receiving that stereotype, oh, here you are, little girl, have a doll. Hey, I don't want a doll, says the little girl, if that's not what she's into. And then this whole sense of why, for the little girl, why don't I fit into that identity? Is there something wrong with me? Perhaps, sort of issues can evolve around stereotyping other people, issues for the people with stereotypes. And have a look at this middle one here. I don't know if you guys watch The Simpsons. It seems to me that 98% of the population in Australia does. I don't, but I know that this guy's a policeman. And because I know stereotypes, I know that he is eating a donut and having a coffee, and he's very large. Why do I know that? Excuse me. I know that because that is a classic stereotype seen in the movies, that American police officers sit around eating donuts and drinking coffee. That's a stereotype, clearly. It's not true of every policeman, especially not here in Australia, I suppose. And what about this one here, the Englishman stereotype? It's just captured in one picture. I don't know whether you know very much about the English. They are perceived to be, lager drinkers. It's always raining. They love their Union Jack. They play their soccer, and they wear their little bowler hats and so forth. This is a pictorial stereotype of what an English person might be. Contrast that with this picture. Now, how do I know this is a picture of, I'm going to say French. With a French, I'm going to say French, yes. Or is it Italian? See, now look, I'm not even very good at the stereotypes, but it's obviously, to me, a Frenchman with his wine and cheese, and another pictorial stereotype. So these stereotypes can create attitudes around things which can lead to misunderstanding. Gaps between stereotypes and reality often cause misunderstandings and result in conflict and lost opportunities. So think about stereotypes around particular cohorts, particular groups in our society. Look at this one here. I'll marry whoever I want, says this lady. Now, you may relate to this picture. You may actually understand what this picture is about on some sort of personal level, because it might relate to your culture. And the stereotype is that a person who has a shawl or you know what it is, may not be allowed to get married, and that's the stereotype. But is it true of everyone in that situation? What about the second one? I am not a colour. What's this guy kind of trying to dispel? What stereotype is this guy trying to cut down? And the last one, I will not cut your grass. So what stereotype is going on there? So for the second one, I am not a colour. Maybe he's an African American saying, listen, I'm a human, I'm not a colour. And the last one, I don't know if you know, but in American society, a lot of Latinos, a lot of South Americans and Central Americans go there, and they take all the menial jobs. And what he's saying is I will not take the job of cutting your lawn. So there's gaps, and there's people wanting you to understand that they are not the stereotype. And so being aware of your own attitudes, being aware of your own the stereotypes that you have around people is really important, because when you bring that self-awareness, as I said, into the relationship, into the conversation, then you can avoid those misunderstandings. Let's have a look at this one.
Hi there.
Hi.
Nice day, huh?
Yeah, finally, right?
Where are you from? Your English is perfect.
San Diego. We speak English there.
Oh, no. Where are you from?
Well, I was born in Orange County, but I never actually lived there.
I mean before that.
Before I was born.
Yeah, like, where are your people from?
Well, my great-grandma was from Seoul.
Korean. I knew it. I was like, she's either Japanese or Korean. But I was leaning more towards Korean.
Amazing.
Hamshasina. There's a really good teriyaki barbecue place near my apartment. So I actually really like kimchi.
Cool. What about you? Where are you from?
San Francisco.
But where are you from?
Oh, I'm just American.
Really? You're Native American?
No, just regular American. Oh, well, I guess my grandparents are from England.
Oh, well. Hello, Governor! What's all this then? Top of the morning to you. Let's get a small tea. Double, toil and trouble. Mind the gap! Beware, Jack the Ripper! Bloody hell! Pip pip! Cheerio! I think your people's fish and chips are amazing.
You're weird.
Really? I'm weird? Must be a Korean thing.
So, by the way, I really love that video. I've actually showed it to my kids. You know, it's so instructional. How often do we do that? You know, we expect a certain outcome because of stereotypes. And then this guy, with his complete lack of self-awareness, just went on and made it worse and worse. So, attitudes, it is the assumptions that we associate with the stereotype, which is what he did. He associated all these, because she looks outwardly, visibly, from a different country, he's associating all these different stereotypes that negatively affects communication, not the stereotype itself. So if the stereotype produces prejudice, bias, or judgment, it may be detrimental to communication and relationships, which it did. You know, I mean, just taking that little video as an example, he could have just had a conversation with her. It really didn't matter that that you know, they had acknowledged, you know, she was originally from Korea and he's originally English. They could have just had a conversation, but he took it to that next level and sort of used the stereotype as a way of creating, you know, a conversation, which she found offensive, which it obviously was. So what assumptions toward the woman was evident in the video, and I think we've covered that, haven't we? The assumption that just because she looked the way that she did, she had a particular background that he was assuming that she would have. So that she was Korean, that she eats kimchi, that she likes teriyaki, barbecue, whatever it was. So relating to someone through a stereotype potentially reduces the person to something that is less than who they are, and that is to the confines of the stereotype. And so I guess that one of the important things to think about psychologically is that when you are relating to somebody, it is okay to take in their culture. It is okay. It's okay to mention it and so forth. But basing your conversation around that, it creates a sense of that that's all there is to them. You know, that's all there is to you. You are just this stereotype. And I mean, think about the way people in your culture perhaps relate to the different genders, right? Think about the way in Australia we relate to the different genders. How do they differ, if at all? So a long time ago, you know, it's the evolution of the way that we relate to gender is very different now. But a long time ago, a woman was pretty much seen as a baby maker and a homemaker. And that was pretty much her job. So every woman was seen as that stereotype. So a male relating to a woman would be thinking, God, well, you know, back in the day, I'm talking about, not now. What will I talk to this woman about? I don't know anything about babies. I don't know anything about, homemaking, because that wasn't what was done. And so relating based on stereotypes became, virtually impossible. It's a wonder they even got married and had relationships. So a little bit more now about attitude. So bias is a prejudice in favour of or against one thing, a person or group compared with another. So a bias is something that we have about something else. Now it can be positive bias. I stereotype that group, or I think about that group as an entity, as a thing, and I like it. So everyone in that group I agree with, right? That's a positive bias. And then you've got that negative bias. I met a guy who was, from that particular group, whatever it is, and I don't like him. So now I am biased negatively. So types of bias are conscious bias, also known as explicit bias. So they're the biases that you are actually aware of. So you not only know them about yourself, but you express them in day-to-day life. So maybe a conscious bias, towards dogs and against cats, that kind of thing. The unconscious bias. Now, the unconscious bias, which is known as implicit, it's something that is hidden. We don't actively demonstrate that that's the bias that we have, is unconscious to us. So we could be playing it out. We actually could be acting in that way, but it's not revealed to us. We don't know that we have this unconscious bias, right? And it can be particularly dangerous in the workplace when we don't know what our unconscious biases are. And I'm going to show you a little slide in a sec showing us that. And it says here, biases are not limited to ethnicity and race. They can be directed toward any difference between people. And here are some of the results within the workplace of unconscious bias. So we could get prejudice. We repress, we aren't aware of this negative bias that we have towards a particular race, and it results in prejudice. Or gender, and it results in prejudice. We're prejudiced. We act differently towards that particular group. Then that's the feeling we have, the prejudice. And then the act of it is the discrimination. So we discriminate. Now we've got the prejudice, we act on it, and we single out people, or, whatever, under whatever category we've put them, and we discriminate. And obviously the category of racism is the discrimination of people based on their race. So there's also sexism based on gender. There's stereotypes, which we talked about. And tribalism, where we feel that because a person is just like us, then they belong in our group, and we push away others who are not like us. And this is a big one. And all of these go on in the workplace, and they can go on quite often in unspoken ways, because we don't realise that's what we're doing. So that's why it becomes these unconscious biases, and the answer to unconscious bias is really to look at your own behaviour, look at the way you behave and question it. So self-awareness. Here's another vid.
The unconscious mind is amazing. It can process vastly more information than our conscious mind by using shortcuts based on our background, cultural environment, and personal experiences to make almost instantaneous decisions about everything around us. The snag is, it's wrong quite a lot of the time, especially on matters that need rational thinking. Here's a classic example. A bat and a ball cost £1 10 If the bat costs £1 more than the ball, how much does the ball cost? Most people, including over 50% of students at some of the world's leading universities, get the answer wrong and say 10 pence. The answer is actually 5 pence. Many of us choose 10 pence without thinking. This is because our unconscious mind uses instinct, not analysis. So our unconscious is fallible, It's also biased. It makes snap judgments of people we meet, categorizing them according to gender, social and other characteristics. In milliseconds, we judge whether somebody is like us and belongs to our in-group. These are the people we favour. So men might favour men, while women might favour women. However, we can belong to different in-groups, and we like to be part of an in-group that's powerful, which could mean a woman favouring a man over a woman. That's unconscious bias. All of us have it, and it colours our decisions without our realising. For example, research reveals that if I were a man, you would be more likely to be nodding in agreement right now, because people pay more attention to a male voice. The Royal Society fosters excellence in science, but this can only be achieved if we select from the widest range of talent. And that's not possible if unconscious bias is narrowing down the field for non-scientific reasons. To lessen the impact of unconscious bias, which is easier for us to notice in others, we are raising the awareness of unconscious bias to members of our selection and appointment panels. We're encouraging panel members to deliberately slow down decision-making, reconsider reasons for decisions, question cultural stereotypes, and monitor each other for unconscious bias. We can't cure unconscious bias, but with self-awareness, we can address it.
Okay, so looking there at that video discussing unconscious bias, and I think it's the final point that was made there. Why should we slow down? Why should we reconsider decisions? And so the reason is, I hope that you understood that, is because we make snap, quick, judgmental decisions based on our unconscious bias. Whereas if we slow down, if we reconsider, if we weigh up different options, we're more likely to become aware of decisions that have been made based on unconscious bias. And that's what that video is getting at. It's getting at that unconscious bias is completely normal. It actually is. Look, it serves us, and if we think biologically, these groups that we quickly form, in-group, out-group, as you might have seen from that video, the in-group, out-group, that sort of tends to help us in our evolution. Our in-group will protect us, the out-group, against us. But when we're doing that in the workplace, when we're doing that, sort of just in every day, we're missing out. That's what that video is trying to tell us, that we're missing out. So instead of quickly making judgments, in-group, out-group, and so forth, let's stop, reconsider, and consider whether that is a decision that I've made based on some kind of bias I have, or whether it's because I've weighed up all the pros and cons, really thought about and reconsidered the decision-making outcomes. Okay, a little bit more about attitudes. A health professional with an appropriate attitude will positively affect the person, contributing to the avoidance of misunderstandings and achievement of satisfying outcomes. So appropriate attitudes. And we're not just talking about attitudes here in the sense that, have a good attitude, have a strong attitude, or the right attitude. It's not about happiness. We're not talking about, being a person with a positive attitude. We're talking about attitudes as they relate to our biases. Okay, so a person with a self-awareness of their biases, a self-awareness of their culture, will have the appropriate attitude, awareness of their culture and others. So health professionals with an attitude of respect, empathy and inclusion naturally communicate to avoid misunderstanding. And so attitudes of respect, empathy and inclusion, they demonstrate that you are thinking about your decision-making process, the other person who you're collaborating with. Self-reflective practice is an important element for health professionals as it provides the opportunity to pause and reflect. And so why am I self-reflecting? It goes right back to what we just talked about, we self-reflect in order to slow down the process of decision making. We self-reflect in order to say, hey, am I making this decision based on a bias that I have, or is this weighed up and logical? Am I making a rational, logical decision? Honest self-evaluation of current values and beliefs that cause bias and prejudice is essential. So these 3 dot points, or these are the elements that make up appropriate attitude. It's about self-awareness and about self-evaluation and about acknowledging, hey, I have these beliefs, I need to watch myself for that. So sometimes the cause of misunderstandings, as we've touched on, relates to emotions. And you can see in that graphic here, how you feel will lead to what you do, and then what you think. Or how you feel leads to what you think, and then what you do. So it can go either way. And quite often, emotions bring us undone and can cause these misunderstandings, whereas they didn't have to. And so emotions can significantly compromise communication. I know that you can think of a time when someone, sort of thought you may have said something, then they got upset, and then they couldn't communicate with you, and you couldn't communicate with them. So we're just, that basic misunderstanding where the other person is sad or upset, okay? But there can be so many others, right? Emotions and feelings are the link between our thoughts and our behaviour, and it is essential that we consider their influence in any misunderstanding. So whenever, even at work, whenever there's a misunderstanding, we want you to think about the many different causes, and we talked about them, context, jargon, language, etc. But we also want you to really consider what has been, the emotional context. What might have what I said have affected that person, and could that be why they're communicating this way now? So emotions can be expressed verbally and non-verbally by an individual, and frankly, we express our emotions non-verbally most of the time. Perception of emotions and feelings attached to an event can hinder mutual understanding. Emotions and interpretation of emotions are not universal. There are some emotions that are universal, happiness, sadness, surprise, anger. They're just 4. I think there are 6. I'm missing a couple. I think disgust is the 5th and 6th. I'll get to the 6th one. But there are these universal sort of emotional expressions or emotions that we all feel. But are you good at understanding, which one is being expressed at that moment? And if you're not, is that causing a misunderstanding? So consider an interaction in which your negative emotions limited your ability to concentrate or understand. Perhaps you reacted emotionally to something that was said and were unable to hear the rest of the conversation, resulting in a misunderstanding. And honestly, that is exactly what happens to us. We can't actually focus on what's happening once we've been told something that triggers our emotion. So internally, we go into, a fight or flight mode. So, we start experiencing things sort of internally which stop our functioning, our executive brain from working, if you like. We're just all caught up in this emotion. And this is a real psychological phenomenon. It can't not happen. The emotion takes over. I mean, if you think now about a time when you were told something really upsetting, and then they went on to describe something else, you say, hang on, I didn't hear the rest of that sentence, because after you told me, that, I just couldn't hear anything else. Just think about that. Think about when that's happened to you. It certainly happened to me. And this is normal. Now put yourself in a work context and think now, how can you control that emotional response? So the person's just told you something and your natural system has gone into overdrive and you're experiencing these things, but really you should be listening to the rest. So, I mean, here again, we talk about emotional intelligence. We talk about how can we be self-aware. Okay, I'm being triggered by something that they've said, but I'm going to have to listen to the rest of it, and I will deal with these emotions. I will process these emotions. I will try to understand myself a little bit later, but right now I've got to communicate. Because if I follow these emotions, if I continue on that thought or that, sort of emotional trajectory, it's not going to end well for me or the other person. So, context. We've finally arrived at the subject of context. Remember, we talked about context as being one of the reasons for misunderstanding. But what is it exactly? So, the circumstances surrounding a message relates to the context. So, the setting, the value positions of people, the appropriateness of the message. Now, you know these things. Sort of, what am I... In what context am I saying this? That's the setting. Sort of what do I mean in terms of what's actually happening to us right now? So, thinking about that terrible show, Maths, and thinking about that guy who kept saying, I love you, I love her to bits, I love her dearly, right? The message was love. Now, the setting was a show in which you're supposed to find the love of your life and stay married. So, the context was that the love expression he was giving the woman was about, extended love and ongoing love. Now, he was delivering that message in a different context of friendship love. But obviously the misunderstanding, because of the context, was inevitable and it was understandable. So the appropriateness of the message was, not appropriate. It was not correct to send that message, I love you dearly, in the context of marriage, because obviously it was just a friendship. The physical context, each atmosphere can have its own set of rules for how to communicate. On the sports field, it's okay to bump each other. Don't try doing that at work. Cultural context, beliefs, values, lifestyles and behaviours. That's sort of self-explanatory when we think about being in a particular room full of people from our culture. We do and say things which would not be, maybe, appropriate in a different, with a room full of people from a different culture or in another cultural context. Social, psychological context, so the norms of the group in a particular situation. So what is appropriate to say in this particular group? I'm not talking about a race-based or gender-based. It's just a group right here, right now. What is appropriate to say? What are the norms of the group? So norms means what is it that we do? What is it that we... what behaviour is expected of us? So they're the norms of a group. What behaviour is expected of this particular group? And so maybe what we do in this particular group, and I've just thought of one and I will say it, would be inappropriate in a different context. So I'm just thinking of, a nudist colony, a bunch of people who in that group, it is the norm to not have any clothes on and it's not a problem. Put them out in a different context, and you've got a problem, misunderstandings, why you won't get them. So the temporal context, the positioning of the message within a sequence of conversational events. So what we're saying here is what you said at what time. So the context in terms of how the conversation evolved and what you said at a particular time. Now looking at this graphic, I see a guy, he's got one eye closed and half a moustache. What's his message here? Is he winking? Has he got something in his eye? Has someone just shaved off half his moustache and he can't believe it? Is he, who knows? So we need to understand the context of that picture in order to be able to understand the message. So images can also be and generally are contextual, unless they have a message attached to them. So further getting into this notion of context, the use of context to determine meaning varies from culture to culture. Did you know that there are cultures in which there is low context and high context expectations? So in different cultures, the level of context matters. I'm going to go a little bit deeper now. If I look there on the far left there at low context, so the communication within a culture that is low context, and again, what does that mean? Low context means that it doesn't matter where we are. This message can almost certainly be understood in many contexts. Okay, so it is specific, it is detailed and precise. They, on the other hand, are poorer at decoding unspoken messages and body language. So there's a lot of explicit need here. Whereas high context means that the communication is kind of based on our relation, our friendship. You know, I know you, you know me, you know what I mean. It's that sort of thing. You know what I'm getting at. Low context, I will tell you exactly what I mean. I'm very precise. High context, you know what I mean, right? And they are more sensitive to non-verbal, therefore, or feelings of others. So, you know what I mean emanates from a sense of, hey, I get you, you get me. I know what you're feeling, you know what I'm feeling, and so forth. And so having a look at the different nationalities there, you've got the people most, I'm going to have to come in close to that. So you've got the Chinese as being very much based on knowing and understanding one another without having to be explicit. And at the far end, there you've got German, Scandinavian, who need a specific and explicit content in order to be able to understand. They don't worry so much about context. So what is important when relating to a person who uses context to determine meaning? In other words, someone like, what have we got there? Someone Chinese or Arabic to the far right there who needs context. Would you adjust your communication style, you know, depending on where they came from? So for example, with someone from China, what sort of communication style would you use? Would you need to be explicit? What about German? Would you need to be explicit there? Have a think about that. Maybe post something on the forum about it. Maybe bring it up with your lecturer. How about a little video about context in business?
In a global company, effective communication is vital to the success of business. But verbal communication across cultures has its limits. What is said often only has meaning when taking the communication context into consideration. The question is, what is that context? By surveying a large group of adults and students, researchers were able to categorically define the components of context that influence our communication. In a nutshell, communication context is complex, featuring nonverbal relational, spatial, and temporal cues. Though we use these cues in our communication, the person with whom we communicate may or may not fully understand them, potentially clouding the effectiveness of communication. As it turns out, people who see themselves as more interdependent with, rather than independent of others, are more likely to rely on contextual cues in conveying and interpreting meanings in communication. These people respond more effectively across different cultural contexts, enabling better communication in a global business environment. If managers can understand both their own communication contexts and those of their employees, they will be able to create more effective communication strategies, greatly improving business efficiency. Wonder if you truly understand what others are talking about? Then read this paper, because it'll help you put things in context.
Okay, so just finishing up there our conversation about context. what they said at the end of that video is that, you know, managers or any worker really who tries to understand the context which the other person is coming from, then is going to actually, you know, be able to communicate better overall. So, styles of communication can also cause misunderstandings. What do we mean by this? Styles of communication vary from culture to culture and between families within a culture. And some cultures expect information to be organised in particular ways. And the way in which we organise information can lead to confusion between people. Expectations around non-verbal communication varies between cultures. Direct eye contact may be expected by some people, and others may experience discomfort with lengthy direct eye contact. And so this is a really important one. When communicating with certain cultures, direct eye contact is not appropriate. Some Asian cultures prefer little eye contact, and some find that little eye contact or no eye contact is a sign of mistrust, or can make that person seem like they are up to something, or, you know, like they're not being direct. And so understanding where, again, look, it all comes back to context, doesn't it? It all comes back to really being self-aware and understanding stereotypes, understanding where that person is coming from and their different styles of communicating and what those styles mean can help you avoid the misunderstanding. But it's important for you to note that this can be a cause of misunderstanding. So we've got a graphic there, direct styles of communicating, lead from A to B, right? Here's the information, here's what I expect. And there are also indirect styles of communication. We're going to have a conversation, we're not necessarily going to talk about the issue, there's going to be an underlying understanding, and when we're finished, we both know implicitly what needs to be done. One's direct, the other one's indirect. And different cultures have different ways of going about getting their meaning across. So a direct style of contact is explicit, it is verbal, the details are verbalized. I tell you exactly what I need. Your lecturer will be this style. Very, very explicit. This is what we need, this is when we need it by. Okay? And it's linear. It goes straight from A to B. Silence is avoided in these communications because silence can be misinterpreted, can't it? It's schedule specific, it happens at this time, and so on and so forth. Reactions oblivious, we do not respond to reactions when we have this direct style of communication. And that can be difficult too. Remember that nothing is perfect, and we're going to have to be self-aware whilst being direct. Do I notice that you've had a different reaction to what I was expecting? If so, make a point of trying to understand what that reaction was. But that's not what we're talking about right now. We're just talking about the direct style, and that does include being oblivious to reactions and also feeling threatened by ambiguity. So there are some cultures which are more like this than others. And then obviously at the other end is the indirect. Messages are implicit and non-verbal. It's implied. I don't tell you directly what I think or feel. It's sort of a message I'm sending, maybe non-verbally. Details are implied. You would understand because of the context. Again, thinking about that context. Low context, high context. Meanings are circular. We could kind of go back and forward, and eventually we will reach some sort of agreement. Those sort of styles of communication. Silence is meaningful in this style of communication. There's an open time and it's flexible. Reactions are reserved. It's not that they're it doesn't matter about reactions, is that they are not even provided with indirect communication style. and we tolerate uncertainty and levels of ambiguity. What does that mean? It means that even if I don't understand, I will. So when I am a person with indirect communication style, talking to another person with indirect communication style, even though I'm not 100% sure where we're going with this, I know that I will. I know that we will sort it out. So there's a sense there, unlike feeling threatened by direct communication style, there's a sense there that it will work out. And we've just got a little question here, what is your culture? Is it direct? Is it indirect? Make a note, write it down. What about Australian culture? What do you think? Are Aussies direct or indirect? Indigenous Australians tend to be indirect in their communication. They are certainly not direct. And what about your partner if you have one? What sort of style of communication does that particular culture have? So something to think about. Other causes of misunderstandings might be expectations which are governed by cultural norms. Now, we defined norms as being the typical behaviour of a particular group. So what is the particular or specific or types of behaviour expected within a particular culture? So every culture and society and most families have cultural norms that affect communicative behaviours. Acceptable social conventions and norms in one culture may be considered rude in another culture. And we can think of that, I can think of various different examples. Shaking hands. I once went to a meeting. I didn't realise that the gentleman was Muslim. He sat down and I extended my hand. So, that was not a part of what he was expecting in terms of culture. So I withdrew my hand and I did this. And we had a conversation. He also left the door open. There were this is when I was younger, there were a lot of different things that I didn't understand about this culture. And that's okay. By the way, in all of this, it's okay not to understand. It's okay to have a misunderstanding. Don't be afraid that there has been or that there might be a misunderstanding. It's how you deal with it, will determine the outcome. So how I'm dealing with it is to go, okay, I've done the wrong thing, now I'm going to do the right thing, and I'll remember from here on in. So, it can happen, and it will happen to you. There is no doubt. It may have already happened to you that the cultural norms from your culture are different to other people's cultural norms, and can lead to a misunderstanding. Social conversation may be governed by norms as well. How are you? That question is not a request for information, but rather a greeting. Have you realised that? Is it part of your culture? Have you realised that about Australians? Hey, how are you? That sort of thing. It really isn't, okay, now I want to hear all about how you are. It's really just a hi, hello, right? Different culture, you've got to sort of become aware of what different cultural norms are to be able to interact kind of easily. What about discussion of topics like politics, religion, sex, and salaries? In some cultures, all these things are avoided. We just don't discuss them. In others, they're open. It's okay. Norms is what we're talking about. What is the typical behaviour of that particular group? What are the norms? So these cultural norms may cause misunderstandings because in my culture it's okay to do this and in your culture it's not. And this happens a lot. I can think of an example. My mum told me a long time ago. She is from Belgium, right, which is in Europe, and she moved to a place in South America, right? So for one, there was a different language, but number two, and the biggest issue here is the different cultural norms. So in Europe, it's okay for a woman to go into a bar and have a drink of beer on her own and have a smoke. In South America, that is not done, and she wasn't aware of it. And so here she was, she'd just moved there to be with my dad, and she was waiting for him or something like that, and she was sitting there having a cigarette, and because she's European, they don't smoke, and a lager, and the guy who was the owner came up and said to her to move on, that's not what was appropriate. That was not the done thing in this particular country in South America, Uruguay. So that's a little bit of an example of how cultural norms can lead to misunderstandings. Anyway, the misunderstanding there was that she was a working lady, and that she was waiting for a client. So emotions, expression of emotions may be avoided. So a culture that does not express emotions may misinterpret a person who does. And I read recently that culturally French women, I think, don't smile a lot, whereas American women do smile a lot. And when American women go over there and smile at everyone, hi, how are you? I'm a bit of a smiler, I must say. They get misrepresented or misunderstood all the time, as though they're trying to, create a relationship or trying to, make a connection, and yet they're not. Just another example of misunderstandings because of cultural norms. Here's a nice little image there. It's okay in some cultures to tap a person on the top of the head. What does it mean? It means that person is diminutive. It means, there's some sort of element of the person being subordinate and small, and that you are superior. And if you go and do that to an adult in some cultures, what you're really saying is, so that's the picture on the right, is, kind of, if you're subordinate to me, I have the upper hand, and so forth. So different gestures, different actions, what do they mean? Actually, I can think of one that's happened at the college since I've been a teacher. One lovely, lovely student just could not stop calling me dear. Oh, Renee dear, how are you? Right? And it's so jarring. It's just so very much not what is culturally normative in Australia to call a teacher or a woman dear. It's related to a whole lot of stereotyping, and it's related to a whole lot of women's rights type things. Dear, it seems diminutive. It's like he's tapping me on the head, basically, right? And it just was really jarring to me. It took about 6 times before he finally figured out I better not say dear when I'm talking to Renee. But in his country, it's okay. I'm an older woman, and this is just how he refers to people. But you get what I'm saying. Like in the context of being a teacher and of being a equal in a culture in which people are equal, saying dear is to me misrepresented as you trying to kind of pat me on the head. So, how do we avoid misunderstandings? I think that this is what this lecture is all about. It's really about saying, here are all the causes. Here are all the potential landmines. And what did we discuss? We talked about language. We talked about context. We talked about cultural norms. We talked about stereotypes and attitudes. And basically, they're out there. All of these landmines are out there, and they're going to trip you up. It's okay. The main thing is to be self-aware, to learn about other cultures and kind of the context that they're coming from. And so that's going to be your main strategy to avoid misunderstandings. And so we've got some here. Specific communicative behaviours can assist in avoiding misunderstandings. So plan and prepare for your interactions, thinking about me And the Muslim gentleman, if I have, sort of had a bit of foresight, I would have realized his name was Ali, and of course he was a Muslim man, and I should have looked into the different ways in which I should be interacting. So plan and prepare for interactions. Know and understand the information for discussion and organize it clearly and carefully. Now we're not talking about cultural norms. Now we're talking about expectations, aren't we? How does this person who I'm going to be speaking to expect to have the information presented to them? Are they high context? Are they low context? Do they want specific, explicit information, or are they going to be okay with a bit of a kind of a summary, right? Concentrate more on the message than the messenger. And so if we do that, then we're really thinking about ourselves and trying to be self-aware so that we're taking everything else into account. Understand the communication expectations of the person involved in the interaction. Cultural awareness with the aim of cultural competence. Now you are going to have a whole course on cultural competence, and it's absolutely fascinating, but this is like a little introduction to it. So it comes into the context of communication. Why do we need cultural competence? Why do we need to have cultural awareness? Because of biases. And when I'm biased and I make biased choices, unconscious bias-based choices, they could be wrong, and I'm not even aware of it, okay? So become familiar with the needs, cultural expectations, and language level of the person. This is an obvious one. And choose your words carefully. Avoid jargon and technical terms. Someone needs to tell my 14-year-old that. Have congruent communication. So what does congruence mean? And we learned that early on. Congruence is being true to what it is that you're experiencing. So if you have a reaction without, going on an emotional tangent, be prepared to express what that is, and therefore be congruent. And that leads to less misunderstandings, doesn't it? Because now I know what you're thinking and you know what I'm thinking. It wasn't expected. It was a little bit of a landmine, didn't know that was going to happen. But my communication of it, my congruence, leads to being able to resolve the misunderstanding. And finally, ask for confirmation of understanding. You all know how to ask for confirmation, is that right? Did I get that right? We know that because we've been talking for weeks now about how to create those open questions, those closed questions, appropriately putting them together, and then, trying to understand, did I get that right? After our summary, did I get that right? And I think that is one of the greatest tools that you can use. How do we resolve misunderstandings if they do come up? So as I said, they are going to come up. Make no mistake, they will. You're going to have misunderstandings as you venture out into the world of community services, because you'll deal with so many different people. And guess what? A lot of those people, they won't have very strong communication abilities. They won't have all this self-knowledge and self-understanding. They will use what they can. And so you will get into trouble, but here's how we aim, or here's some strategies to aim to resolve them. So be aware that there is a misunderstanding. So, name it. Control negative emotions. And this is really important, and it goes back to this idea of emotional intelligence, where we register for ourselves, I've had a negative emotion, but we don't act on it. We compartmentalize it. And remember that if we're engaged in that, our whole mind and body is going to be going, left, right, and center. Be centered, compartmentalize it, and try to control it. And so that way you're going to be able to continue the communication more effectively without triggering the other person, because of your strong emotion. Then we take responsibility for the misunderstanding regardless of the cause. This is really important. not apportioning blame is really important, and it's part of that that EQ, that emotional intelligence, being able to just take responsibility and seek to resolve the issue. Understand what caused the misunderstanding. So now you've become aware of the many different causes that I've called them landmines, the many different landmines that are out there. Which one tripped you up? Which one tripped up this particular conversation? Make a conscious decision to restore communication to achieve mutual understanding. So now we're in reparation. Now we're going to repair what's gone wrong. We sort it out, we're congruent, we use those strategies, and we seek to repair the misunderstanding so it doesn't lead to that conflict, which is what week 8 was all about. And then we focus on restoring understanding with clear explanation and humble validation of understanding. So it's just using humility, that's using a sense of emotional intelligence. Again, I keep using that word because that's what all of this is. It's that self-awareness. And being able to create an environment in which the self-awareness leads to better understanding. I'm aware, I'm humble, I'm aware a mistake was made, I'm aware, I'm congruent, and so forth. Remember that isolating the cause of the misunderstanding is not a substitute for action to resolve the misunderstanding. You know, those sort of skills, those resolution of conflict or resolution of misunderstanding, those types of skills are very advanced, and you'll need to practice them. And you will. And that's what we're doing here in communication strategies. As a health professional, the major concern is the effect of misunderstandings on the emotions of the person and the outcome of the service. So now putting you straight into the context of community services, misunderstandings can lead to a whole lot of problems. And more than likely, they're not going to be yours. They're going to be problems for your client. Why? Because your client comes in to conversation or to consult with you, and already there's a power imbalance. We know that. We know that the person who holds all the knowledge, or the person who is not seeking the help, has the power. So already your client is vulnerable. So thinking about some things that can lead to misunderstandings, a sense of vulnerability is an emotion, isn't it? So feeling that emotion might lead your client to saying things or to not hearing things, because they're caught up in their emotion, their vulnerability. And so you must be extra careful, as the community service worker, to ensure that the outcome is positive for your client. How do you do that? You use the strategy. What's one really great thing to do is to ask, did I get that right? Did I understand correctly? Right? So we're checking in to make sure that the flow of information is clear and not misunderstood. We need to control our frustrations, impatience and intolerance. There are misunderstandings. Vulnerable individuals quickly receive and interpret such negative responses, which can contribute to further misunderstandings and add further complexity to the misunderstandings, which is what we just discussed. It's hard to hear when you're upset. It's hard to listen when you're angry or when you're confused. Remembering too that vulnerable clients may register anger, but it might be fear, confusion, loss of power, loss of many things. There might be grief involved, like underlying all of that, what you see, that vulnerable expression might be, such as anger, could be a whole lot of other things. So you've got to control that frustration that you have with that client and have empathy and slow down and recognize that there might be misunderstandings. The health professional needs to decide on which to consider first, emotions or information. Clarification of information may resolve negative emotions associated with misunderstandings, and conversely, resolving client emotions can accelerate understanding of the previously misunderstood information. So suddenly you're telling someone as the community services worker, that they will no longer be receiving benefits, for example, or they will no longer have access to a particular resource for whatever reason. Now, you've communicated that, but there's a list of options there for them. Now, think about receiving that information first and foremost. What emotion is going to be triggered in your client? They might be angry, upset, confused, etc., etc., and that is going to cloud their ability to listen. So what do you do first? Do you clarify the information, or do you resolve the client emotions? Well, you think about it. By clarifying the information, you're just going to keep rambling on. No, but listen, I've got this other information here, and they're all still stuck, right, in their emotion. So perhaps in that situation, it might be more productive to talk about, the emotion, to be congruent. Hey, I noticed that, you became really upset, or I noticed that there was an issue then. Let's talk about that. Because the thing is I've got some more information to give you, which, might lead to a better outcome. So in order to resolve misunderstandings, in community services work, you have to be self-aware, and you've got to be engaged. You've got to be watching and listening. It's not easy. It takes practice. Thank you so much for listening to today's lecture. And again, so good luck. Listen over and over again. If you need to, make sure you write down things that weren't clear to you, and take it to your lectures. Have a great week, and I will see you next week.